Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into a massive global challenge.
Yeah.
Homelessness. We pulled together quite a range of sources for this. We've got like a foundational overview from the Institute of Global Homelessness, a detailed report looking at homelessness services across Europe, a scientific study on the links between homelessness and mental health, and also something really interesting, a Reddit thread with perspectives from people who've actually lived through it.
Yeah, and our goal here, it isn't just to list what these sources say. We really want to pull out the core insights for you. How is homelessness actually understood globally? What are the root causes, the impacts it has, and really importantly, what potential solutions are out there? What's being tried?
Yeah, exactly. We want to connect the bigger policy ideas with the individual human stories.
Yeah.
Because we're not just looking at statistics. We're also trying to understand the on-the-ground experiences, the practical ideas coming from communities themselves. Okay, so where do we even start with defining something this huge, this complex? Global homelessness.
Well, that's the first hurdle, isn't it? It becomes really clear really quickly that there's no single definition everyone agrees on. And this isn't just about words, this lack of a common understanding. And it really impacts our ability to measure the scale of the problem, to compare data across countries.
It's really quite something when you look at the different approaches. Like India's 2011 census, their definition was super broad. Basically anyone not in a census house, just a structure with a roof. But then you zoom into a state like Karnataka, and suddenly they have 5 categories, even including people sleeping at work. It makes you think, what exactly are they measuring?
Precisely. And you see these variations everywhere. South Korea, they distinguish between vagrants and rough sleepers, different types maybe. Russia's definition is just no fixed abode, very minimal. Greece talks about insufficient accommodation, which is a bit vague, isn't it?
Right.
And Zimbabwe's definition, not owning a home in an approved area, that really highlights how much local laws and culture shape the whole concept.
Yeah, these differences really show how subjective it all is.
Yeah.
Which is where the Institute of Global Homelessness, the IGH, comes in. They saw this was a major problem for, tackling it globally. So they developed this IGH global framework. Lots of international work went into it.
And what's clever about their framework, I think, is they didn't try to force one single definition on everyone. Instead, they identified 3 broad categories of people lacking access to minimally adequate housing. It gives a shared vocabulary, a way to compare things globally. Even if countries still focus on their own specific issues within those categories, it's about finding common ground.
Like a common language for this really complicated thing. And it's interesting, isn't it, that their framework was influenced by the European ethos typology. It sort of shows an evolution in thinking.
It does. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the causes, the risk factors, the impacts. It helps to think about the different ways people experience homelessness. Kuhn and Kulthane in the U.S., they talk about categories like chronic homelessness. People really entrenched, often with complex needs. Then there's transitional homelessness, usually shorter term, moving towards housing, and episodic homelessness, where people cycle in and out of it.
And what really jumps out is that the long term, the chronically homeless group, while often smaller in number, they tend to use a much higher share of services and resources. That pattern holds up, doesn't it? U.S., Europe, Canada.
It does. It makes you think about where interventions might have the biggest impact. At its core, though, homelessness really boils down to a fundamental lack of access, lack of safe, affordable housing, and the supports people need. But getting to that point, well, there are multiple layers. You've got the big economic and structural issues, affordable housing shortages, extreme poverty, discrimination, huge factors.
Absolutely. And then there are what some call system failures, gaps in the safety nets, the support systems that are supposed to be there. And individual things, too, relational factors like relationship violence, personal trauma. Those play a massive role. And then sometimes it's just a sudden shock, right? What the IGH calls an exogenous shock, a health crisis, losing a job, eviction, domestic violence. The immediate trigger.
Yeah, and something often overlooked is the impact of rural to urban migration. People move to cities for opportunities, but they can be incredibly vulnerable, navigating unfamiliar challenges without support networks.
The IGH overview gives some stark examples. China, where rural migrants might be shut out of welfare, seen as illegal vagrants. Ghana, poverty driving people to cities with no housing security. Cambodia, land loss, lack of ID blocking jobs. India, seasonal migrants living right at their workplaces, often in really precarious conditions. It highlights these broader shifts.
And the informal economy plays a role, too, in rich and poor countries alike. That unpredictable income makes stable housing really difficult for many. Then there's the really complex issue of substance abuse.
Yeah, it's definitely not simple cause and effect. The sources show it's multi-directional, isn't it? Substance abuse might come before homelessness, or it might develop during, maybe as a coping mechanism, or just make things worse.
Right. And it can really damage support networks, relationships with institutions. Plus, many services require sobriety, which is a huge barrier. That New Delhi study on street youth, it really showed how prevalent addiction can be in some groups.
And mental health is another critical piece, often tangled up with substance abuse.
We know mental health challenges are more common in homeless populations, definitely. But it's really important to stress. While mental illness increases vulnerability, it doesn't automatically cause homelessness. The core issue is still lack of housing and support.
Yeah, a U.S. study found huge unmet needs for both mental health and substance abuse services among homeless individuals. It just shows how inadequate the systems often are.
It paints a picture of all these interlocking challenges and the health consequences. They're devastating.
Yeah, the IGH report is blunt. Homelessness is deadly. Mortality rates are significantly higher than the general population globally. And it's even worse for specific groups, street youth, people with mental illness, young women, the elderly.
Well, think about it. Living without stable housing. How do you manage chronic illness? Get proper nutrition, maintain hygiene, avoid the elements, avoid violence. The toll on physical and mental health is just immense, often irreversible.
And violence. Wow. The sources really highlight this awful two-way street between violence and homelessness, especially for women. Domestic violence, sexual violence, they're major drivers into homelessness, but also tragically common during homelessness.
That South Africa study on invisible partner violence among women living rough, it's chilling how much goes unreported.
And the rates of psychological verbal violence are apparently alarmingly high for everyone.
Studies in São Paulo, Toronto, they found a really high levels of trauma, PTSD, linked directly to experiencing violence while homeless.
And the fear of violence can even stop people from using shelters, like that example from Hungary. It's terrible.
And that study from Jacksonville, Florida, linking childhood trauma directly to chronic homelessness later in life, it shows these deep, long-term impacts.
It's a really grim picture. And then on top of all that, you have the issue of criminalization. Instead of help, some places are basically making it illegal to be homeless.
Exactly. Like Hungary, punishing people with imprisonment for habitually residing in public spaces. It's quite shocking. Or reports from Cambodia of rounding up people for so-called re-education.
And old laws, like the Bombay Prevention of Begging Act in India, giving police really broad powers that can target homeless people.
And disturbingly, it seems all Australian states and territories have laws that can effectively criminalize homelessness in some way.
It just seems so backwards, doesn't it? Instead of tackling why people are homeless, it just pushes them out of sight, makes it hard to get help.
Well, thankfully, there does seem to be a growing pushback. The European Parliament has been clear. Homelessness isn't a crime. It's not a lifestyle choice. And in the U.S., HUD is even offering funding incentives for communities that prevent criminalization.
And there's movement to repeal that old Bombay Act in India, too.
Still, it creates real dilemmas on the ground, right? For police, for service agencies, balancing rights, public space use, health risks.
Yeah, that London editorial viewpoint suggesting enforcement might push people towards help. It shows how complex the debate can be.
But the counter-argument, like in that British Columbia case, focus on housing first, not punishing survival. That feels much more rights-based, doesn't it?
Definitely. So if criminalization is not the answer, what are the effective strategies? What actually creates systemic change?
Well, the IGH report really stresses tackling those structural factors we mentioned. Housing affordability, discrimination, unemployment, and building strong partnerships is key.
And a crucial mental shift, right? Moving from just managing homelessness to actually aiming to end it with clear, measurable goals.
Exactly. Successful strategies seem to have common threads. Well-coordinated systems designed for outcomes, citywide plans integrating prevention, emergency response, and housing supports. And critically, the actual resources to make it happen, including enough genuinely affordable housing. That's huge.
The IGH points to some high-level frameworks. The U.S. National Alliance to End Homelessness has its 4 elements: plan for outcomes, close the front door, prevention, open the back door, housing pathways, build the infrastructure.
And the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness talks about a system of care prevention, emergency services, accommodation supports, and crucially, shifting investment priorities towards prevention and housing as you make progress.
And Fianza in Europe offers 10 approaches, things like being evidence-based, participatory, having a legal basis for housing rights.
In the Finland example, the PA-VATO programs, that's a really powerful case study. They achieved major reductions in long-term homelessness through serious, sustained coordination. It shows it can be done.
That coordination piece feels absolutely vital, breaking down the silos.
Oh, definitely. The IGH report points out how often housing, social services, health, employment supports, they all operate separately. Different funding, different rules. It's a nightmare to navigate.
So bringing everyone together around shared goals, city agencies, nonprofits, the private sector, and crucially, people with lived experience, that seems like the way forward.
Yeah, creating a more streamlined, efficient system where everyone's working together, sharing info, plugging the gaps.
Like that medicine hat strategy in Canada, systemic shifts, coordinated intake, shared data, linking up with justice and child services. Sounds really comprehensive.
Or the coordinated access and assessment models in the U.S. trying to create that single point of entry. Makes sense, right? Improve efficiency, better data.
And the CAHP systems, coordinated assessment and housing placement, taking it further by directly linking assessment to housing, using vulnerability tools to prioritize.
And Finland's PAAVO, again, multi-sector coordination, government, private sector, NGOs, all working towards real achievable targets, like actively replacing old shelters with permanent supportive housing.
And that point about engaging people with lived experience, it seems so fundamental, but maybe doesn't always happen meaningfully.
It's critical. Initiatives like the Chorn Summit in South Africa or Community Solutions 100,000 Homes campaign, they show the incredible value you get when people directly affected are genuinely involved in planning the solutions. Their insights are invaluable.
Okay, so looking at specific intervention models, harm reduction and housing first really stand out, don't they? Especially for people with complex needs.
Absolutely. They represent a really significant positive shift. Housing First, pioneered by Dr. Sam Sembaris. The core idea is simple but powerful. Get people into permanent, affordable housing first, quickly, without preconditions like sobriety. Then provide the wraparound supports they need.
Because stability is the foundation, right? You can't really work on other issues effectively if you don't know where you're sleeping tonight.
Exactly. And the evidence backs it up. High housing retention rates, less use of expensive crisis services like ERs and jails. It makes sense socially and economically.
And harm reduction. That seems like a really pragmatic and compassionate approach, too.
It is. It accepts that substance use might be part of someone's reality right now and focuses on reducing the associated harms, meeting people where they are, building trust.
Like the wet shelters idea, no sobriety requirement.
Yeah.
Reaching people who might otherwise be completely excluded.
Right. And interestingly, some evidence suggests that in that stable, non-judgmental environment, people's alcohol consumption might actually decrease over time.
Prevention, though. That's the ultimate aim, isn't it? The IGH report breaks it down usefully.
Yeah, the 3 levels. Primary prevention, the big picture stuff, poverty reduction, anti-violence work, early childhood support, anti-discrimination efforts, universal interventions.
Then secondary prevention, targeting those at immediate risk or newly homeless. Things like family mediation, landlord-tenant help, shelter diversion, better discharge planning from institutions like jail or foster care.
And tertiary prevention, helping people who've been homeless avoid falling back into it, reducing repeat episodes.
And the report stresses using data to target these efforts effectively, right? Making sure resources go where they're needed most.
Definitely. And then for accommodation and supports, needs vary hugely, don't they? Crisis versus complex needs.
So rapid rehousing for people in a more temporary crisis.
Right.
A lighter touch, cost-effective way to minimize time spent homeless. The U.S. and Canada data looks promising for the right people.
Right. And then for those with more significant long-term needs, there's permanent supportive housing. That's long-term affordable housing combined with individualized services, counseling, mental health, substance abuse treatment, job training, whatever's needed.
And crucially, your housing isn't dependent on participating in those services, right? Housing first, support second.
Exactly. Security of tenure is key.
But all of this, it hinges on having enough affordable housing in the first place, doesn't it?
Fundamentally. The IGH report is clear. Shortages of affordable housing seriously undermine everything else. They mention policy tools like rent control, used in places like the Netherlands and China, and the role of public and social housing, even though that seems to be decreasing globally, unfortunately.
So the IGH report wraps up by saying we need to learn from the places having success, right?
Hmm.
Those with clear targets, systems focused on ending homelessness, coordinated services, using evidence.
Yeah, and adapting to new challenges, homeless migrants, encampments becoming more visible, rapid urbanization. It's constantly evolving. Community Solutions calls homelessness a complex problem, changing information, fragmented responsibility, needs flexible approaches.
Okay, now that scientific article on homelessness, housing instability, and mental health,
Yeah.
it really dives deep into that connection.
It does. It confirms that bidirectional link we touched on. Mental ill health can make you more vulnerable to homelessness, and the trauma and stress of homelessness can worsen existing conditions or trigger new ones. It goes both ways.
And it tackles that misconception, doesn't it? That mental illness causes all visible homelessness.
Right. It acknowledges deinstitutionalization played a role, closing institutions without enough community support did leave many vulnerable. But the studies show maybe only 25–30% of homeless individuals have a severe mental illness. It's a major factor, but not the whole story for most people.
It's sobering thinking about doctors like Jim Withers and Jim O'Connell doing street outreach back in the 80s, healthcare workers on the front lines.
Yeah, the article points out how physical health problems are often the visible signs of a shortened lifespan, but the invisible emotional toll, especially on kids, is just enormous.
And the massive gap between the level of mental health need and the services actually available, it's a huge systemic failure.
The article also highlights those structural barriers, especially in the U.S. Housing as a commodity, exclusionary zoning blocking affordable options, the ongoing legacy of racial discrimination disproportionately affecting Black communities and other groups.
These are fundamental issues blocking access to stable housing for everyone.
But there are hopeful signs, too. International efforts like the UN Sustainable Development Goal, #11, aiming for safe, affordable housing for all, UN guidelines on the right to housing.
And innovative programs like the Banyan in Chennai, India, for homeless people with severe mental illness, or the Friendship Bench in Zimbabwe, community-based mental health support.
And again, Housing First comes up as a success story, an evidence-based way to enact the right to housing with mental health care integrated.
There's growing recognition, too, of housing as a social determinant of health. Some U.S. states are even using Medicaid for housing supports now.
Yeah. The article really concludes we have to tackle the structural barriers, train healthcare providers better on social determinants, and fundamentally recognize that stable, safe housing is essential for mental health and well-being, period.
And finally, that Reddit thread.
Wow.
Such a valuable, direct look from people with lived experience, sharing what they think would be most helpful in a community center.
It's incredibly powerful, isn't it? Just the idea of a center planned by someone who's been there. And the services they discussed cover the basics: food, showers, laundry, clothes, but also crucial supports: case management, mental health, addiction help, job skills, housing assistance.
But it was the extra stuff, the really practical things suggested by users that hit home for me. Safe overnight parking, a way to get mail-like lockers for an address, help getting ID documents. These seem small, but they're huge barriers.
Absolutely. And ideas like maybe compensating people for sharing their insights, helping with budgeting, or setting up bank accounts, especially for young people, childcare for single parents. It shows such a deep understanding of the day-to-day struggles and what's needed to actually rebuild a life, not just survive.
Yeah, that whole hand up, not just a handout feeling really came through. Skills training, mentorship for kids, storage lockers, even basics like sleeping bags, tents, phone chargers, toiletries, socks, underwear. Dignity matters. Practical help matters.
So pulling it all together, this deep dive really shows just how complex defining and addressing global homelessness is. We've seen how interconnected the causes and impacts are, how vital coordinated evidence-based solutions like Housing First can be, and maybe most importantly, the absolute necessity of listening to and learning from the experiences of people who've actually lived it.
Yeah, and reinforcing that idea of housing as a fundamental human right, a key determinant of health, both physical and mental.
So as we wrap up, here's something for you, our listener, to think about. Considering everything we've discussed, the diverse needs, the different solutions, what single systemic change do you think would make the biggest difference in reducing homelessness in your own community? And what steps, maybe even small ones, could be taken to advocate for that change?